let us go back in time. Let us go back to the 1930s and see what we can learn from that depression, how it may apply to our very own today. I'm joined by Jeff Snider, the head of global research for Alhambra Investments. Jeff, we're going to be talking about a great essay at Real Clear Markets by you. It's called Higher Prices Must Be Engineered to Restrain Dictators, and it was posted on April 30th, 2021. I'm going to read this opening paragraph, and then you tell us what exactly happened next. Even before he was elected president, it was said that Franklin Roosevelt was given a clear choice by one of his closest advisors. George F. Warren was an economist who, like Irving Fisher, demanded a radical departure from tradition and orthodoxy in order to arrest the world's slide into financial anarchy. No matter how dear and historically abetted, neither solvency nor even soundness might prevail in a world drowning in deflation. And then, Jeff, he told, what did Warren tell Roosevelt? One of the great lines, I've never heard this before. What did he tell him?
He must choose between a rise in prices or a rise in dictators. Pretty stark and simple, right?
Yes. All right, well, okay.
And that was, then, obviously the connection was, at the time, this was 1932, and, things were the worst they probably have ever been in American history, and it was just as bad throughout the rest of the world. And Warren could clearly see where this was going, as did Roosevelt and many others, that look, you have an economic depression this bad, an economic collapse this bad, what's inevitably going to follow, historical examples all throughout, all those things, is dictatorships and conflicts and all the other things, which is exactly what did happen. So we have to ask, well, wait a minute. There was a rise in prices in the 30s, but there was also the rise in dictators, and both coincided with the 1940s, which was the worst conflict in human history. So, all right, they were right about one thing, but maybe not right about the other.
Let's go back before we get to the 1940s. Let's go to October 1932, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I am very surprised to learn that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was an austerity hawk candidate. I mean, he is the epitome. He is the standard bearer of the Democratic Party spend like there's no tomorrow for the people that want to do that on the Democratic Party. Let me read part of his speech in October 1932. If the nation is living within its income, its credit is good. If in some crisis it lives beyond its income for a year or two, it can usually borrow temporarily at reasonable rates. But, my friends, if, like a spendthrift, it throws discretion to the winds and is willing to make no sacrifice at all in spending, if it extends its taxing to the limit of the people's power to pay and continue to pile up deficits, then it is on the road to bankruptcy. Franklin Roosevelt?
Yeah, and I think, there's not only the misconception about that, there's also, that was not just a campaign. I mean, this was not just, hey, I'm going to say whatever I need to say to get elected. He maintained that attitude throughout his entire time, which does, you think, well, how can that possibly be? The guy had the biggest deficits proportion in history. And what he, for example, I think it was the 1936 or 1937 budget statement, what I didn't include it in the article. What he said was, look, we are running a balanced budget here, except for emergency programs. So if you take away all the emergency stuff, our books balance. Our expenditures match our income. Where it doesn't match is the fact that we're in a depression and we have to do all of this stuff. And I did include the quote that he had in Pittsburgh in 36, where he said, look, it's a crime against humanity to sit idle and try to run a balanced budget, including these emergency items, given the absolute devastated state of the economy and the markets and the entire world at that point. So in terms of Roosevelt's view, what he would tell you, and what he did say on many occasions was, look, we try to balance our budgets, and we do. It's just that we have this enormous emergency that demands an enormous fiscal response to it. Which, again, this should start to sound very familiar.
That's right. And so let's see, from 1932 to 1936, the fiscal deficit went from, let's see, a negative 2.7 billion, then 2.6, 3.6, 2.8, 4.3 billion, all net deficits. And
yeah, back when a billion was an enormous sum. Today it sounds like a rounding error, but back then billion was trillion.
And the business community, they weren't too thrilled about it. I don't know how polling worked back then, but this was very interesting to get a sense. Now we're moving 4 years forward. So we're now in October 1936, and Roosevelt wants to get a sense of, well, what does the business community think of all this deficit spending? They sent out letters to some 12,000 newspaper editorialists to kind of get their sense of what's happening in your locale. And what did the community tell Roosevelt, the business community?
Too much debt, way too much debt. Knock it off. They said, look, if we want to restore business confidence, stop spending money. And it was a uniform. I mean, I think the percentage was something like 89% agreed that there was way too much fiscal deficit. I mean, it was just a problem. Yeah, and then we have to reconcile that with the fact that the 1936 election was one of the most lopsided in history, in Roosevelt's favor. It wasn't. I mean, it was. It may have been. I don't know for sure. I'm not. Don't know the presidential election, but I think it may have been, if not the most lopsided, biggest landslide. It was definitely top 1, 2, or 3. So they didn't like the debt, didn't like the deficits, but gave Roosevelt the benefit of the doubt because, as Roosevelt said, what else are we going to do? What other alternatives do we have?
Let me read that. Now we're on October 1936. We're back in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It's almost like 4 years to the day, the same location. What? Here's what he says. Now as president, to balance our budget in 1933 or 34 or 35 would have been a crime against the American people. To do so, we should either have had to make a capital levy that would have been confiscatory, or we should have set our face against human suffering with callous indifference. When Americans suffered, we refused to pass by on the other side. Humanity came first. Jeff.
Yeah, I love how he says confiscatory through taxes when he was actually confiscatory through the dollar. So, I mean, that's I think that's really the point I wanted to make, was that, look, there was really not that, in terms of what they were thinking, there was no other choice. Either you're going to confiscate gold or you're going to confiscate through taxes. And what Warren and Fisher and John Maynard Keynes, who wrote to Roosevelt several times, said was, you can't confiscate through taxes because that will be even more deflationary. Maybe you don't want to run excessive budgets because it's not in your nature, but that's your only option. You got to do it because, as Roosevelt also said, we were the only ones who could spend at that time.
I am, Jeff. So yes, you're mentioning gold. Help me now segue, because you've caught me at I'm trying to figure out how to segue to the next section here. Let's see. We could talk about gold. You just talked about Fisher. Here, let me read a quote then, and let's see if you can take it from there. How can we can go from mid-1930s America to present day. Here, let's use this quote here. Who cared about the soundness of gold money for the wealthy banker when so many millions, tens of millions, remained out of work with no relief in sight? Sounds like today, pretty much.
Yeah, that's the point. That Roosevelt eventually swayed him to confiscatory monetary and dollar policy was that, look, everybody who said you go off the gold standard will lead to ruin. And the guy was like, what are you talking about? It's 1932. We're already ruined. How much more ruin can ruin become? We need to do something radical. And at that time, the government deficits and what came to be known as Keynesianism was a radical solution. And the idea was to try to, as Irving Fisher called it, reflation. Let's get things moving back in the right direction so that recovery would then follow. And that starts with inflationary policies of fiscal expanding. The monetary stuff came in much later, but that was the idea. Let's get prices moving in the right direction. We'll get the economy moving in the right direction. We'll hire, the government will hire a bunch of people. Sounds like MMT. We'll hire a bunch of people, even though they're out of work. We'll have them do stuff. We don't care what it is as long as they're getting a paycheck. All of these aggregate demand type of policies that Roosevelt said, well, why not try this stuff? Because we're already ruined to begin with. And the idea was that would lead to the rise in prices, therefore avoiding the dictators. And as we know, the prices did rise, but so did the dictators. And we actually look back at it, and even Roosevelt admitted this several times in the later 30s, especially after the 37, 38 debacle, which was another mismanaged depression within a depression. What they realized was that, yes, we got prices moving in the right direction, but a rebound is not a recovery. Reflation by itself is not sufficient. Maybe all this deficit spending, yeah, maybe it helped jobs saved, quote unquote, but it sure didn't bring about recovery, and it left the U.S. in a much worse situation than it had been in previous to the collapse. So, yes, don't want to do huge deficits, but that's what we're going to do because we don't know what else to do since we're already deep in the hole to begin with. But that's not the same thing as saying we know how to get out of it. All they're saying is we know we're in it.
Well, at least they knew they were in it. I don't believe our president, not present, but our present leaders know that they're in it. And I'm following along Miss Kelton's tweets, and she is just slapping her head like this, that they are just trying to go about it doing the same old, same old. And, you know, she has her point of view of how she wants to do it, but I'm in agreement with her that they should try something radically new. Anyway, so I'm supporting.
No, that's really what MMT is. It's really it's a mirror image of what we're talking about. They see the same problems and come to completely different ideas about what should be the solution to it. I think the answer, both in the 1930s as well as the current age, is that we need to understand what actually happened before we start trying to think we're going to get our way. We're going to come up with solutions to get our way out of it. If you don't understand where the hole came from in the first place, how do you really know you're able to get out of it? And the lesson of the 1930s was, no matter how radical you become, it doesn't necessarily mean radical does not necessarily equate to successful.
Let's get back to the monetary side. During this whole time, the government was spending like never before. Deficits were off the charts. But as Roosevelt said, it was the only game in town. And the bond market, the bond vigilantes, knew that, so they didn't go after the government. They wanted to fund the safest, most secure entity possible, the most liquid. And that's why we saw falling rates throughout that whole time period. You make that point here. Falling rates.
Yeah, and that was a pervasive belief. We talked about it in an early episode. Howard Buffett, Warren Buffett's father, the congressman from Nebraska, was a famous gold bug and said, look, these deficits are going to ruin us. And yet, in actual fact, up until that point, it was the opposite. The more the government issued in debt, the more the banking system was only too happy to buy it at rising, increasing prices, not increasing yields. It was the opposite. And so what we see here again is that the point throughout history, the deflation comes first. It comes before any sense of proportion or propriety about the government's deficit. If we're in a deflationary period, the government can get away with doing these things, which is another problem with doing these things. Because they didn't work and the government could get away with doing it, they kept doing more. And it became almost a self-reinforcing lock, right? The worse it got, or the less recovery there was, the more the government felt it needed to do, the more it contributed to the problem, the more the government would have to feel it could do. And then there was no bond vigilantes or no way to interrupt that process because the bond market, the banking system was only too happy to buy more of the government's debt. So you get stuck in this situation where if you don't understand the situation, it seems like there's no possible way to get out of it. And that gives rise to all the extremes that come with it. In the 1930s, it wasn't just dictatorships. There were all sorts of other problems too, including in the United States. There was labor strife. There's social, I mean, all of these things that happen because we don't understand the situation that we're in. And I love the way you always point this out, Emil, is that the difference today, we're almost in a worse situation today is because nobody knows that we even have a problem.
Yeah.
Everybody think, oh, the economy is booming. Before COVID, it was fantastic. Why would we even care about any of these things? Meanwhile, labor participation is at a rate that it was decades ago, even before 2020, no matter what the unemployment rate said. And oh, by the way, it doesn't matter how reckless the government is. For some reason, we can't seem to understand, despite everybody saying there's too many treasuries, the banking system, the monetary system only wants to buy treasuries, which it tells you everything you need to know. But if you don't know how to interpret that signal, you think the economy's booming and the government deficits are actually really helpful and all these other things, you can't pinpoint what's really wrong. And if you can't pinpoint what's really wrong, like the 1930s leading to the 40s, you'll never be able to truly get out of it. So the rise in prices by itself was a necessary, but it wasn't a sufficient condition to forestall the rise of the dictators. Because prices did rise, it just didn't mean recovery.
There's a couple more quotes from this paper that I want to get to, and we'll just talk around them. The first one here is from Milton Friedman, and you tell us what this is in reference to. With respect to discount policy, the Federal Reserve was misled by the tendency present recurrently throughout its history before and since to put major emphasis on the absolute level of the discount rate rather than on its relation to other market rates.
Low rates are stimulus.
The Fed thought everything was good or correct.
Friedman's monetary critique, which came in the 1960s, after much later, what he said was that the Federal Reserve mistakenly pursued tight money policy, believing that they were pursuing a easy money policy because interest rates ended up low and lower. They also said that, well, we don't see much borrowing at the discount window for reasons that had nothing to do with it. So they thought, well, the demand for money must be low. They mistook low interest rates for accommodative monetary policy. Boy, geez, doesn't this sound familiar? And they made a major mistake of allowing monetary deflation, not just to develop, but become so extreme it led to the catastrophe of the Great Depression. And what he also said was that back then, as the 1960s, as well as today, there's this tendency to associate low interest rates as something positive, as well as a positive result from the Federal Reserve's policies. That was a mistake in the 30s. Low interest rates were not stimulus, and the interest rates were not low because of the Federal Reserve. They were low because the Federal Reserve wasn't doing its job. And that's also applicable. And because of that, as we just said, because the monetary situation is so desperate, the banking system, the financial system quite naturally demands the safest and most liquid instruments, because it makes sense. If the monetary environment is less than forthright and less than plentiful, why wouldn't you have to pay attention to safety and liquidity concerns above everything else, including the government's penchant for just borrowing like a drunken sailor?
I think the analogy to present day is just perfectly clear to our audience. So let me read one last quote here from the 1930s. Jeff, we've talked about it already, but it's such a good quote, I wanted to share it with the audience. And it's by George F. Warren in October 1936.
The same George Warren as had advised FDR to go off the the gold standard years earlier.
A society based on individual enterprise is so efficient in production that it brings enormous advances in the well-being of the common man. Recent world experience has shown that the worst enemy of such a society is instability in the value of money. We have learned by hard experience that failure to control the value of money leads to innumerable foolish efforts to control everything else, and often culminates in dictatorships. Beautiful. Jeff, do you have any final thoughts on this essay, which I noted here, one of your best pieces?
That should be the final thought, because that was something spoken in the 1930s by a guy who advised Roosevelt to go off the monetary standard, and here he was saying what I believe is a universal, or should be appreciated as a universal truth, which is monetary instability leads to everything wrong.
All right, well, let's move on to part 2 of the episode then.